You think of the medieval era, and you probably picture knights in shining armor, damsels in distress, and maybe a few monks diligently copying manuscripts. But one image that likely doesn't spring to mind is a society obsessed with the most intimate details of your life. Think powdered wigs and furtive glances behind lace fans. Prepare to have that romantic notion shattered. The truth about intimacy in the medieval era is far more shocking, far more public, and frankly, far more horrifying than anything you've ever been taught. Forget everything you think you know about prudish medieval attitudes toward sex. The reality is that intimacy wasn't a private affair. It was a public spectacle, meticulously scrutinized, regulated, and often brutally enforced. We're not talking about the occasional whispered scandal. We're talking about a culture where your very ability to perform in the bedroom could be dragged into a courtroom, debated by lawyers, and judged by strangers. Ready to throw everything you know about medieval times into the fire? Good, because that's precisely what we're here to do. The idea that medieval society was a bastion of chastity and sexual repression is a carefully constructed myth, a convenient narrative that ignores the stark, often brutal realities of daily life. This wasn't a world of hushed whispers and hidden desires. It was a world where the bedroom door was often open, where the most private acts were subject to public scrutiny, and where the consequences of failing to meet societal expectations could be devastating. Imagine a world without privacy. Imagine every aspect of your personal life, from your financial dealings to your most intimate relationships, laid bare for public consumption. That was the reality for many in the medieval era, and when it came to matters of the heart and other parts of the anatomy, the stakes were often life or death. The power structures of the time, the church, the nobility, the ever-watchful eyes of the community, all conspired to create a suffocating atmosphere where privacy was a luxury few could afford. And in the absence of privacy, the most vulnerable, especially women, were left exposed to exploitation, humiliation, and often unspeakable violence. We're talking about an era where the consummation of a marriage wasn't just a private act between two people. It was a political act, a social act, and often a public act, witnessed by family, friends, and even complete strangers. A world where the inability to produce an heir could be grounds for annulment, and where the pressure to procreate often led to invasive medical examinations and the public airing of the most intimate details of a couple's life. So, ditch the romantic notions of knights and castles. Prepare to confront a world where the boundaries between public and private were blurred beyond recognition, where the concept of personal autonomy was virtually non-existent, and where the most intimate aspects of human life were often weaponized to control and manipulate. We're diving headfirst into the disturbing truth about intimacy in the medieval era, a truth that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about this often misunderstood period in history. And trust me, it's a truth you won't soon forget. Before we delve into the specifics of the case, it's crucial to grasp the utterly alien landscape of public intimacy that defined the medieval experience. We need to tear down the modern filter through which we view history and truly grapple with the idea that what we consider sacredly private was, for them, a matter of public record. It's about to get uncomfortable because you're about to witness the kind of social norms that would land someone in jail today. Think about your wedding night. A sacred moment between you and your partner. Now imagine that moment unfolding under the watchful eyes of dozens of witnesses, their presence a constant reminder that your union is not just about love and commitment, but about dynastic power, political alliances, and the continuation of a family line. This was the reality for many noble couples in the medieval era, and it wasn't just the nobility who lived under this intense scrutiny. Even among the common folk, the details of their intimate lives were often subject to public discussion and judgment. Gossip, rumors, and accusations could spread like wildfire, damaging reputations and ruining lives. The concept of personal space, simply didn't exist in the same way it does today. This lack of privacy wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of the era. It was a deliberate tool of social control. The church, with its emphasis on confession and penance, played a significant role in shaping this culture of public intimacy. Every sin, every transgression, every private thought was subject to divine judgment and, often, public condemnation. The nobility used public spectacles of wealth and power, including weddings and other ceremonies, to reinforce their authority and maintain social order. And the community as a whole, through gossip and social pressure, kept its members in line, ensuring conformity to accepted norms and values. The result? A society where intimacy was not a refuge, but a battleground, where the stakes were high and the consequences of failure could be devastating. So, as we prepare to examine the tragic fate of our royal bride, remember this: she lived in a world where her body was not her own, where her desires were secondary to the needs of her family and her kingdom, and where her most intimate moments were subject to public scrutiny and judgment. It's a world that may seem almost incomprehensible to us today, but it's essential to understanding the forces that ultimately led to her fiery demise. Brace yourselves, because what follows is a story of betrayal, manipulation, and the horrific consequences of a society obsessed with power and control. Before we delve into the ghastly details of that wedding night, let's rewind back to the political chessboard where this young woman, barely more than a child, became a pawn in a game of power. Forget romance, forget fairy tales. This was about bloodlines, alliances, and securing a dynasty. And the bride? Well, her desires were about as relevant as a peasant's opinion on tax day. Our story unfolds in a kingdom teetering on the edge of war. Factions vying for control, whispers of treason in the halls of power, and a desperate need for a unifying force. Enter the royal lineage, a family steeped in tradition, yet plagued by internal strife. To solidify their claim, a marriage was proposed. A strategic alliance with a neighboring kingdom, promising stability and, more importantly, a buffer against their enemies. The bride, of course, was a princess, raised in the gilded cage of royalty. She was chosen not for love, but for her lineage, her perceived purity, and her ability to produce an heir. She was a symbol, an object, a bargaining chip. Her education focused on needlepoint, courtly manners, and the art of subservience. Her dreams, if she even dared to have them, were irrelevant. She was born to serve the crown, and marriage was simply another form of service. But this betrothal was not without its shadows. Whispers circulated like a chilling draft through the castle corridors. Omens, they said, ill tidings. The sort of superstitious murmurings that, in a more rational age, would be dismissed as folklore. But in this time, such things held weight, especially when cloaked in fear and political intrigue. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible. During the formal announcement of the engagement, a raven, considered an ill omen in many cultures, flew directly into the royal chambers, circling the heads of the assembled nobility before crashing into a stained glass window, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. A collective gasp rippled through the room, quickly masked by nervous coughs and forced smiles. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Then came the dreams. The bride, plagued by nightmares, spoke of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her bedchamber, of suffocating darkness and a burning sensation that would jolt her awake in a cold sweat. These were dismissed as mere anxieties, the product of a young woman overwhelmed by the prospect of marriage. But the dreams persisted, growing more vivid, more terrifying with each passing night. The natural world, too, seemed to conspire against the union. Freak storms ravaged the countryside. Crops withered in the fields, and livestock fell ill. These were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, a warning against the impending marriage. Some whispered that the bride was cursed, that her very presence brought misfortune. The royal astrologers, consulted for their wisdom, offered cryptic pronouncements. They spoke of conflicting celestial alignments, of a dark star rising in the bride's constellation, of a future shrouded in uncertainty and peril. Their words, intentionally vague, were nonetheless interpreted as a dire warning. Even within the royal family, dissent simmered. The bride's own relatives, sensing the unease, voiced their concerns. They questioned the wisdom of the alliance, pointing to the bride's youth, the political instability, and the growing number of ominous signs. But their voices were drowned out by the relentless march of political expediency. The groom, a man of considerable power and influence, remained strangely detached from the proceedings. He viewed the marriage as a necessary evil, a means to an end. He cared little for the bride herself, seeing her as merely a vessel for producing an heir. His own reputation was tainted with rumors and suspicion. Whispers of cruelty, of a dark temper and a penchant for violence, followed him like a shadow. Despite the growing unease, the wedding preparations continued. The date was set, the invitations were sent, and the elaborate rituals were planned. The royal treasury was plundered to ensure a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur, a display of wealth and power designed to quell any doubts and solidify the alliance. But beneath the veneer of opulence, a sense of foreboding lingered. The bride, pale and withdrawn, moved through the preparations like a ghost. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now haunted by a deep sorrow. She knew, deep down, that this marriage was not a beginning, but an ending. A descent into darkness from which there might be no return. She was a lamb being led to the slaughter, a sacrifice to appease the gods of politics and power. And the fire that awaited her on her wedding night was merely the culmination of a tragedy long in the making. A tragedy foretold by omens, ignored by ambition, and sealed by the silence of a young woman robbed of her voice, her agency, and ultimately, her life, the wedding spectacle. A carefully choreographed dance of power, wealth, and societal expectation. But scratch beneath the surface of dazzling jewels and silk finery, and you'll find something far more sinister. The chilling reality of an unwilling bride. Think of a modern royal wedding. Millions watching on TV, right? That's quaint. That's tame. Imagine instead every intimate detail, and I mean every detail, being not just scrutinized, but actively orchestrated by the very power structures that bind you. This wasn't just a celebration of love. It was a calculated move on a geopolitical chessboard. Alliances forged, territory secured, bloodlines cemented. And at the heart of it all, a young woman, reduced to a pawn in this brutal game. The procession itself was a statement. Not of joy, but of dominance. The bride, laden with jewels that felt more like shackles, paraded through the streets. Each diamond, each pearl, whispering tales of sacrifice and obligation. The roaring crowd, a sea of faces blurred into a single, consuming entity. Their cheers weren't for her happiness, but for the continuation of a lineage, the stability of a kingdom. They cheered for their own security, bought and paid for with her freedom, and the wealth? Oh, the obscene displays of wealth. Gold-threaded tapestries, mountains of food that could feed a village for a year, fountains flowing with wine. It wasn't about celebration, it was about intimidation. A show of force designed to impress all eyes, cow enemies, and remind everyone of the sheer, unyielding power of the royal family. Look, they screamed without words, look at what we possess. Look at what we can afford to sacrifice. But amongst the splendor, whispers of unease permeated the air like a subtle, poisonous gas. The bride's face, pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors surrounding her. Her eyes reflecting not joy, but a haunting premonition. She knew her role, she understood her duty. But the weight of it all, the sheer, suffocating weight, was etched into every line of her delicate features. And there were other signs too, if you knew where to look. The forced smiles of the courtiers, their eyes darting nervously, betraying a hidden anxiety. The tense silence that fell whenever the king, a man known for his unpredictability, entered the room. The almost frantic energy of the wedding. Planners, desperately trying to maintain an illusion of perfection, as if they could somehow contain the simmering tension beneath the surface. The church played its part, of course. Blessings were bestowed, vows were exchanged, all under the watchful gaze of God and the equally watchful gaze of political ambition. But even the sacred rituals felt tainted, corrupted by the underlying power dynamics. The promises of love and fidelity rang hollow, replaced by the cold, hard reality of duty and obligation. The feast was a grotesque parody of merriment. Mountains of roasted meats, enough to feed an army, were devoured with a ravenous hunger that mirrored the insatiable appetites of the court. Drunken laughter filled the air, a cacophony of forced jollity designed to mask the underlying dread. Every toast, every song, was a reminder of the bride's sacrifice, her role in securing the future of the kingdom. And then, the dancing. A slow, deliberate waltz, a carefully choreographed display of unity and strength. But as the bride moved, her every step measured, her every gesture controlled, one couldn't help but wonder what thoughts swirled behind her vacant eyes, what dreams were being crushed, what hopes were being extinguished. The wedding night loomed, a dark and ominous cloud hanging over the festivities. The consummation, the ultimate symbol of unity, was not a private affair, but a public spectacle. Witnesses would be present, their ears pressed against the door, their eyes peeled for any sign of success. The pressure was immense, the stakes impossibly high. And so, as the day drew to a close, and the shadows lengthened, the ominous undertones of an unwilling bride reached their crescendo. The wedding spectacle, a grand display of power and wealth, was about to reveal its true, horrifying face. This was not a celebration of love. This was a prelude to tragedy. A tragedy witnessed by thousands, but understood by none. A tragedy sealed with a kiss and ignited by a flame. The hours leading up to the consummation were a meticulously orchestrated display, a performance of power masked as tradition. Think of it as the opening act of a play where the stage is set, the actors are positioned, and the audience, a room full of your parents, your peers and the kingdom, awaits the curtain to rise on your most intimate moment. First, the ritualized undressing. Forget the gentle unveiling we might imagine. This was a public disrobing, performed by attendants while guests offered body commentary and raucous encouragement. For the bride, particularly, this was an experience of profound vulnerability. Her gown, a symbol of her status and purity, was removed piece by female relatives, each layer revealing more of her body to the judging eyes of the assembled onlookers. Whispers would ripple through the room, observations made about her figure, her skin, her suitability for bearing. Heirs. Imagine the sheer terror of knowing you were being assessed, graded like livestock on your reproductive potential. The groom fared no better. Stripped of his finery by male attendants, he too was subjected to lewd jokes and unsolicited advice. His virility was questioned, his prowess debated, all while he stood exposed, facing the daunting task ahead. This was not a moment of quiet anticipation, of shared intimacy. It was a public spectacle, designed to emphasize the power of the state and the importance of the union. Following the undressing came the procession to the bedchamber. The bride and groom, often naked or partially clothed, were led through the castle or manor, accompanied by musicians, singers, and a throng of well-wishers. Torches illuminated their path, casting long distorted shadows that danced on the walls, turning the entire event into a macabre parade. The noise was deafening, the music, the singing, the drunken shouts and laughter, a constant reminder of the public nature of this supposed private act. Reaching the bedchamber offered little respite. The room, far from being a sanctuary, was typically filled with witnesses. Royal weddings often saw dozens of nobles, clergy members, and court officials crammed into the space, their presence deemed necessary to verify the consummation and ensure the legitimacy of any future heirs. Imagine trying to relax, to connect with your partner with an audience of silent, watchful observers. The bed itself was often a focal point of the spectacle. Elaborately decorated with rich fabrics and symbolic emblems, it served as a stage for the performance to come. The sheets, usually white, were carefully inspected before and after the consummation to confirm the bride's virginity and the successful completion of the act. A stained sheet was proof, a testament to the fulfillment of the marriage contract. The absence of such proof could lead to accusations of impotence, barrenness, or even witchcraft, with devastating consequences for both parties. Before the couple could even lie down, blessings were often bestowed upon them. Priests or other religious figures would offer prayers for fertility, for a long and prosperous marriage, and for the health of any future children. These blessings, while seemingly benevolent, served to further emphasize the religious and societal importance of procreation. The act of sex was not simply a private expression of love. It was a sacred duty, essential for the continuation of the family line and the stability of the kingdom. The weight of expectation on the bride, in particular, was immense. She was expected to be a virgin, obedient, and capable of producing healthy heirs. Her value lay solely in her reproductive capacity. If she failed to meet these expectations, she faced shame, rejection, and even potential punishment. The pressure to perform, to satisfy her husband and the assembled witnesses, was almost unbearable. Imagine the psychological toll of knowing that your worth as a woman, your entire future, depended on your ability to conceive a child under the watchful eyes of the entire court. And what of the groom? He too faced pressure, albeit of a different kind. He was expected to be virile, potent, and capable of fulfilling his marital duties. His masculinity was on display, his reputation at stake. Failure to perform could lead to accusations of impotence, ridicule, and even challenges to his authority. The burden of upholding his family's honor, of ensuring the continuation of his lineage, rested squarely on his shoulders. These rituals of undressing, procession, and witnessed consummation were not simply quaint traditions. They were deliberate acts of public humiliation, designed to reinforce the power of the state, the authority of the church, and the importance of procreation. They stripped away any semblance of privacy, turning the most intimate act into a public performance. The weight of expectation, the fear of failure, and the constant scrutiny created an atmosphere of intense pressure and anxiety, turning what should have been a moment of joy and connection into a terrifying ordeal. And in the case of our royal bride, this already hellish situation was about to become infinitely more horrifying. The ceremonial preparation process was a horror show of public humiliation disguised as celebration. First came the undressing ritual. The bride and groom would be disrobed by their respective relatives, while wedding guests sang songs that were, let's be honest, incredibly lewd and made crude jokes. Every item of clothing removed was accompanied by cheers and inappropriate comments. The bride's mother and aunts would remove her dress, commenting on her body's readiness for childbearing, poking and prodding as if she were livestock being assessed for market. The groom's male relatives would undress him, while making jokes about his capabilities and offering last-minute advice on technique, advice that was probably less about pleasure and more about producing an heir. Then came the procession to the probably less about pleasure and more about producing a bed chamber. Often, musicians would lead the way, playing ribald tunes that only amplified the awkwardness. The couple, usually teenagers, would be paraded through the castle or manor house, past jeering crowds who offered words of wisdom and shouted encouragement. Imagine the pressure, the sheer terror, of being displayed like that, your most private act turned into a public spectacle. The bed itself was often specially made, elaborately decorated, and placed in the most prominent room. It was a symbol of fertility, a stage upon which the future of the kingdom, or at least the family, would be decided. But the worst was yet to come: the witnesses. These weren't just chaperones hovering outside the door. They were in the room. High-ranking nobles, clergy members, trusted advisors, all crammed into the bedchamber, ostensibly to ensure the consummation took place, but also, let's be frank, to satisfy their own morbid curiosity. They would position themselves strategically. Some near the bed, others by the fireplace, all within earshot, and, if the curtains weren't drawn tight enough, within eyeshot too. They would engage in hushed conversations, make nervous coughs, and generally create an atmosphere of unbearable tension. The purpose, officially, was to verify that the marriage had been physically consummated. Without that, the union could be challenged, the alliances broken, and the inheritance thrown into chaos. This practice wasn't just confined to royalty. It extended down to the nobility, albeit on a smaller scale. Wealthy merchants, powerful landowners, anyone with something to lose would often subject their children to this humiliating ritual. It was a demonstration of power, a way of ensuring that the marriage contract was fulfilled, and that the family's interests were protected. The pressure on the couple was immense. Not only were they expected to perform on demand, in front of an audience, but they also had to contend with the knowledge that their performance was being judged, scrutinized, and potentially gossiped about for years to come. The bride, in particular, bore the brunt of this pressure. Her fertility was crucial. If she failed to conceive, she would be blamed, shamed, and potentially replaced. The groom, while not immune to the pressure, was often given more leeway. His virility was important, but the primary focus was always on the bride's ability to produce an heir. Now, imagine the sheer vulnerability of being a young woman, perhaps as young as 13 or 14, stripped naked and placed in a bed with a complete stranger, surrounded by judgmental eyes, knowing that your entire future depended on your body functioning as expected. The lack of privacy, the lack of consent, the complete absence of any sense of intimacy. It's almost impossible to comprehend the psychological trauma that these women must have endured. And then, in some cases, something went horribly, tragically wrong. Perhaps the bride was unwilling. Perhaps she was terrified. Perhaps she was simply unable to cope with the pressure. Whatever the reason, sometimes, on these wedding nights, in these chambers full of eyes and ears, violence erupted. It wasn't always physical violence. Sometimes it was a quiet, internal violence, a breakdown of the spirit, a crushing of the soul. But sometimes it was something much more visible, much more shocking. Something that would leave an indelible stain on the history books and haunt the halls of the castle for centuries to come. Something like fire, a sudden, brutal act of violence. But was it truly sudden? Or was it the inevitable culmination of a system designed to crush the will of the individual, particularly a woman forced into a political marriage against her desires? Let's dissect the events leading up to this horrific immolation, peeling back the layers of intrigue and desperation that fueled the flames. We've painted a picture of the wedding night, a spectacle of wealth and power. But beneath the glittering surface lay a cold, hard reality. The bride, an unnamed royal, was not a willing participant in this charade. Sources suggest whispers of her resistance, quiet acts of defiance against a fate she abhorred. These whispers are often dismissed, seen as romantic embellishments. But consider the historical context. A woman of noble birth, intelligent and aware of her position, would not blindly accept her fate without at least some internal struggle. Imagine the psychological toll of knowing you are nothing more than a pawn in a political game, your body and your future sacrificed for the sake of alliances and power. The pressure to produce an heir to secure the dynasty would have been immense. And if the bride harbored any resentment, any secret desires for a different life, those feelings would have festered, creating a volatile cocktail of emotions. But internal turmoil alone cannot explain such a violent act. We must examine the external factors, the forces at play within the royal court. Who stood to gain from the bride's demise? Were there rival factions vying for power, seeking to destabilize the newly formed alliance? The groom, the king himself, must also be considered. Was he a cruel and domineering figure, capable of inflicting such a horrific act? Or was he simply a puppet, manipulated by forces beyond his control? Eyewitness accounts, though scarce and often unreliable, paint a conflicting picture. Some speak of a tense atmosphere in the bedchamber, a palpable sense of unease. Others recall the bride appearing withdrawn and melancholic, as if resigned to her fate. Still others whisper of heated arguments between the bride and groom in the days leading up to the wedding, suggesting a relationship already strained beyond repair. Now, let's focus on the practicalities. How could such a fire erupt in a chamber supposedly under constant guard? The wedding night was a spectacle, yes, but it was also a security risk. The royal bedchamber would have been heavily guarded, with servants and officials stationed nearby. For a fire to break out undetected and spread with such ferocity suggests either gross negligence or deliberate sabotage. Consider the potential for flammable materials. Medieval chambers were often draped with heavy tapestries and filled with flammable bedding. A single spark, perhaps from a stray ember or a carelessly placed candle, could have quickly ignited the room. But why was the fire allowed to spread so rapidly? Why were the guards unable to extinguish the flames before they consumed the bride? The answer, perhaps, lies in the prevailing attitudes towards women in that era. A woman's life was often considered less valuable than a man's, particularly a royal woman whose primary purpose was to produce an heir. If the guards and officials believed the bride was simply a hysterical woman, they might have hesitated to intervene, fearing accusations of impropriety or insubordination. Furthermore, the public nature of the wedding night could have contributed to the tragedy. The presence of witnesses, while intended to ensure the consummation of the marriage, could have also hindered efforts to extinguish the fire. No one would want to be seen acting in haste or disregard for protocol, especially in front of the royal court. The result was a deadly combination of negligence, indifference, and the suffocating weight of tradition. But what if the fire was not an accident? What if it was a deliberate act of arson, orchestrated by someone with a motive to kill the bride? This theory, though more sinister, cannot be dismissed. The royal court was a hotbed of intrigue and betrayal, where alliances shifted like sand, and enemies lurked in the shadows. The bride, as a symbol of a new alliance, could have been seen as a threat by those who opposed it. Perhaps a disgruntled member of the groom's family, resentful of the bride's foreign origins, decided to take matters into their own hands. Or maybe a rival faction, seeking to destabilize the kingdom, saw the bride's death as a means to achieve their goals. The possibilities are endless, and the truth may never be fully known. One particularly chilling theory suggests the bride herself was responsible for the fire. Driven to the brink of despair by her forced marriage, she may have chosen to end her life in a dramatic act of defiance. While this may seem far-fetched, it is important to remember the level of desperation she must have felt. Faced with a life of misery and servitude, suicide may have seemed like the only escape. Imagine the bride, alone in the darkness of the bedchamber, her mind racing with thoughts of escape and rebellion. She may have secretly obtained flammable materials, perhaps smuggled in by a sympathetic servant or disguised as ordinary bedding. As the wedding night wore on and the pressure mounted, she may have made the fateful decision to set herself ablaze, sacrificing her life in a final act of defiance against a system that sought to control her. This theory, though speculative, offers a glimpse into the mind of a woman trapped in a desperate situation. It challenges the notion that the bride was simply a passive victim, instead portraying her as a woman capable of taking control of her own destiny, even if it meant embracing death. Regardless of the exact circumstances, the fire remains a haunting reminder of the brutality and injustice of the medieval era. It is a story of power, betrayal, and the tragic consequences of a society that valued tradition over individual freedom. And as we delve deeper into the investigation, we will uncover the secrets and lies that have been buried for centuries, revealing the truth behind the royal bride who was set on fire on her wedding night. The question remains, was she a victim, a pawn, or a rebel consumed by the flames of her own making? The answer, as we will soon discover, is far more complex than we ever imagined. The bride is dead, set aflame on her wedding night, in the very bed she was meant to sanctify. The stench of burnt flesh, expensive linens, and shattered expectation hung heavy in the air, heavier perhaps than the accusations that would soon follow. The immediate aftermath was predictably chaos. But it was a calculated chaos, a flurry of activity designed to obscure as much as it revealed. The royal court, a viper's nest of ambition and whispered secrets, snapped into a grotesque parody of mourning. The initial investigation, if it could even be called that, was a farce. A rushed, sloppy affair orchestrated more to protect reputations and quell unrest than to uncover any semblance of truth. Suspicion, predictably, fell first upon the obvious: servants, outsiders, anyone beyond the immediate circle of power. The kindling, the oil, the opportunity, they claimed, were almost easily accessible to the lowborn. But did that make sense? Let's be brutally honest here. Consider the layers of security, the constant surveillance, the sheer impossibility of sneaking enough flammable material into the heart of the royal palace undetected. These weren't village idiots we're talking about. They were masters of intrigue, professionals at maintaining appearances. A rogue serving girl, even with the most volatile motive, simply wouldn't have had the access, the resources, or frankly, the nerve to pull off such a spectacular act of defiance. And yet, that's exactly the narrative the king, or rather, his counselors, were pushing. A nameless, faceless servant, driven by jealousy, spurned affection, some equally flimsy excuse that would neatly tie up the loose ends and allow everyone to go back to their backstabbing as usual. Rumors, of course, ran rampant. They always do. Whispers in darkened corridors, hushed conversations behind tapestries, accusing glances that spoke volumes. Some said the bride was already with child by another man, and the fire was a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of her infidelity. Others claimed she was barren, cursed by some ancient god, and the flames were a divine retribution for daring to enter the marriage bed. Still others, bolder perhaps, hinted at conspiracies within the royal family itself. A rival claimant to the throne, perhaps, using the tragedy to destabilize the kingdom. But beneath all the whispers and speculation, a more sinister truth began to emerge. A truth that the king and his advisors were desperately trying to suppress. The bride had been difficult. Let's not mince words here. She wasn't the docile, obedient pawn they had expected. She had resisted. She had argued. She had, in the ultimate act of defiance, refused to embrace her role as a mere vessel for producing heirs. And in a society where a woman's worth was measured solely by her ability to bear children, where her autonomy was non-existent, that refusal was tantamount to treason. The official inquiry, led by the king's most trusted, shall we say compliant, advisors, focused almost exclusively on external threats. They interrogated the servants, of course, applying various levels of persuasion to extract confessions. They questioned the bride's handmaidens, twisting their words, manipulating their fears. until they echoed the narrative the court wanted to hear. They even brought in supposed experts in witchcraft, eager to find evidence of demonic influence. Anything to avoid looking inward. But the court itself? The nobles who had witnessed the wedding, who had been present at the feast, who had, in some cases, even helped prepare the bridal chamber, they were largely left untouched. A few polite inquiries, a few perfunctory statements of condolence. And that was it. The rush to judgment was almost palpable. A desperate scramble to find a scapegoat, to close the case, to restore order. Because the truth, the real truth, was far too dangerous. The truth would have exposed the rot at the heart of the monarchy, the hypocrisy of the church, the casual cruelty that pervaded every aspect of court life. The truth would have forced them to confront their own complicity in the bride's death, and so they silenced it. They buried it beneath layers of lies, of fabricated evidence, of carefully crafted propaganda. They found their scapegoat, a hapless servant who conveniently died during interrogation, an unfortunate accident they claimed. The case was closed. Justice, if it ever existed, was blindfolded, gagged, and thrown into the dungeon. But the rumors persisted. They lingered like the smoke from the pyre, poisoning the atmosphere, reminding everyone that something terrible had happened. That a young woman had been brutally murdered, not by some external force, but by the very system she was meant to uphold. The investigation, therefore, wasn't an investigation at all. It was a cover-up. A carefully orchestrated charade designed to protect the powerful and silence the truth. And in the end, it succeeded. The official narrative prevailed. The servant was blamed. The court moved on. And the bride, well, she became just another ghost in the castle, a silent reminder of the price of defiance in a world where women had no voice, no power, and no hope. But let's peel back the layers of this historical tragedy. Let's move beyond the immediate horror of the wedding night and delve into the shadowed corners of our bride's past, seeking the whispers of resistance and the lurking motives of those who surrounded her. Because a life, even one tragically cut short, is more than just its ending. It's a tapestry woven with experiences, relationships, and quiet acts of defiance. Our bride, for the sake of clarity, we'll call her Lady Annalise, though her true name has been lost to the voracious appetite of history. Lady Annalise wasn't merely a pawn in a royal game of chess. She possessed a sharp intellect, a deep love for learning, and a spirit that chafed against the gilded cage of her birth. Court records, fragmented as they are, hint at this. Letters, intercepted and preserved for posterity, likely as evidence of her unsuitable nature, reveal a mind grappling with the constraints placed upon her. She questioned the dogma, challenged the assumptions, and dared to imagine a world beyond arranged marriages and political maneuvering. This wasn't the submissive, demure ideal of a medieval woman. This was a woman who thought. And that, in itself, made her dangerous. Consider her education. While noble women were typically schooled only in domestic arts and perhaps a smattering of religious doctrine, Annalise demonstrated a keen interest in philosophy, history, and even, whisper it, natural sciences. She devoured books, engaging in lively debates with visiting scholars and challenging their pronouncements with unsettlingly logical arguments. Her tutor, a monk sworn to secrecy, documented her unnatural curiosity and troublesome independence of thought. He attempted to steer her towards more acceptable pursuits, but Annalise, it seems, was unyielding. And then there's the matter of her betrothal. This wasn't a love match. Those were fairy tales reserved for peasant girls and wandering minstrels. This was a cold, calculated alliance designed to solidify the ruling family's power. But Annalise didn't accept her fate passively. She resisted. Not with open rebellion, mind you. That would have been suicidal. But with subtle acts of defiance. Delays in the negotiations. Feigned illnesses. Even, and this is gleaned from a heavily redacted courtier's diary, a whispered threat to refuse the marriage outright. A threat that was quickly and brutally silenced. Why was she so resistant? Was it simply a yearning for autonomy? Or was there something more? A hidden love, perhaps? A secret ambition that this marriage would crush? The records are frustratingly vague, but rumors persisted of a forbidden romance with a common-born scholar. A relationship that was discovered and ruthlessly suppressed. Could the loss of this love have fueled her resentment and driven her to desperate measures? We can only speculate, piecing together fragments of truth from a shattered narrative. But let's not focus solely on the victim. Let's turn our gaze to the potential perpetrators, to those who might have benefited from Annelise's demise. Because in the murky world of royal politics, everyone has a motive. First, consider the groom himself, the king. A man burdened by the weight of his crown, constantly threatened by rivals and plagued by anxieties about succession. Did he harbor suspicions about Annelise's loyalty? Was he concerned about her potential to disrupt his carefully constructed empire? Or, perhaps more chillingly, was he merely a pawn in a larger game, manipulated by advisors who saw Annelise as a threat? Then there's the Queen Mother, the power behind the throne. A woman hardened by years of political intrigue, fiercely protective of her son and her family's legacy. Did she see Annelise as an unsuitable match? A threat to her influence? Perhaps she preferred another alliance, one that would have brought greater benefits to the crown. The record suggested deep animosity between the two women. A clash of wills and a struggle for dominance within the royal court. And what of the king's closest advisors? The ambitious courtiers who whispered in his ear, feeding his fears and manipulating his decisions. Did they have their own agendas? Were they vying for power, using Annelise as a scapegoat in their own treacherous schemes? The court was a viper's nest of ambition and betrayal, and Annelise, with her independent spirit and her potential to upset the established order, may have become a target in their deadly game. Don't forget the church. While outwardly preaching piety and obedience, the church held immense power, both spiritual and temporal. Did Annelise's questioning of dogma and her interest in forbidden knowledge threaten the church's authority? Did they see her as a heretic, a dangerous influence, who needed to be silenced? The church's involvement in the investigation, or rather, its deliberate lack of involvement, raises serious questions. And finally, let's consider the bride's own family. A disgraced lineage, desperately clinging to their remaining influence. Did they see Annelise as a means to regain their lost status? Or were they simply desperate to appease the king, willing to sacrifice their daughter to secure their own survival? The family's history is shrouded in scandal and intrigue, and their motivations remain a mystery. The truth, as always, is elusive, buried beneath layers of political maneuvering, religious dogma, and historical revisionism. But by examining Annelise's past, her acts of resistance, and the potential motives of those who surrounded her, we can begin to piece together a more complete picture of this tragic event. A picture that reveals not just a horrific act of violence, but a complex web of power, betrayal, and the silencing of a woman who dared to defy the expectations of her time. And perhaps, a conspiracy that reached the very highest echelons of power. The initial investigation was predictably a chaotic mess. Accusations flew faster than sparks from the blaze that consumed the royal bride. Suspicion, a venomous serpent, slithered through the castle halls, poisoning every conversation. Who could have committed such an atrocity? And more importantly, why? The obvious answer, witchcraft, hung heavy in the air. But easy answers rarely satisfy the appetite of political intrigue. The king, beside himself with grief and fury, though perhaps more concerned with the diplomatic fallout, demanded immediate action. A council of advisors, each with their own agenda, was convened. The whispers began almost immediately. Could it have been a rival kingdom, attempting to destabilize the alliance? A disgruntled noble seeking revenge for some perceived slight? Or, as some darkly suggested, could it have been someone closer to home, someone within the royal family itself, vying for power? The first to be questioned were, naturally, the servants, the women who had prepared the bride for her wedding night, the guards stationed outside the chamber, the cooks who had prepared the wedding feast. All were subjected to intense scrutiny. Their testimonies, riddled with inconsistencies and half-truths, only served to muddy the waters further. Fear, after all, is a potent silencer of truth. But mere questioning wasn't enough. The king, desperate for a culprit, authorized more persuasive methods. The dungeons, usually reserved for common criminals, became the stage for a grim theater of pain. Torture, a routine tool of justice in the medieval era, was employed with brutal efficiency. Rack, thumbscrews, and sleep deprivation, all were used to break the will of the accused and extract confessions, regardless of their veracity. One by one, the servants cracked. A kitchen maid, accused of harboring resentment towards the bride for a perceived insult, confessed to conspiring with a mysterious stranger. A guard, caught in a lie about his whereabouts on the night of the fire, admitted to accepting a bribe from an unknown source. These confessions, extracted under duress, were eagerly seized upon as proof of guilt. But doubts remained. The stories were too convenient, too pat. They smelled of fabrication, born of fear and desperation. The investigation then turned to those of higher rank. Suspicion fell upon members of the court, those with the most to gain from the bride's demise. Lady Beatrice, a distant cousin of the king and a woman known for her ambition, was brought in for questioning. Her sharp wit and unwavering composure initially held her in good stead. But when confronted with evidence of a clandestine meeting with a known enemy of the crown, her facade began to crumble. The interrogation of Lady Beatrice was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Interrogators played on her vanity, her ambition, and her fears. They threatened her reputation, her family, and her very life. Slowly, relentlessly, they chipped away at her defenses until, finally, she too confessed. She admitted to plotting against the bride, but claimed she only intended to disgrace her, not to kill her. She named Sir Reginald, a knight in the king's service, as her accomplice. Sir Reginald, a man of impeccable reputation and unwavering loyalty, was the last person anyone would have suspected. His interrogation was a brutal affair, a desperate attempt to confirm Lady Beatrice's claims. He was subjected to the most horrific forms of torture, yet he maintained his innocence. His cries of anguish echoed through the castle walls, but he refused to yield. The king, torn between his desire for justice and his respect for Sir Reginald, ordered a halt to the torture, but the damage was done. Sir Reginald's body was broken, his spirit crushed. He lingered for days, a shadow of his former self, before finally succumbing to his wounds. His death, though never officially acknowledged, cast a long shadow over the entire proceedings. As the interrogations continued, a pattern began to emerge. It became clear that the investigators weren't necessarily interested in finding the truth. They were looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame for the tragedy, someone who could appease the king's anger and quell the growing unrest among the populace. The focus shifted from uncovering the facts to constructing a narrative that would satisfy the demands of political expediency. The confessions, though obtained through dubious means, were carefully pieced together to create a compelling story. Lady Beatrice, driven by jealousy and ambition, had conspired with Sir Reginald, a disgruntled knight seeking revenge for a perceived slight, to disgrace the bride on her wedding night. They had enlisted the help of a kitchen maid and a corrupt guard to carry out their plan. The fire, they claimed, was an accident, a tragic consequence of their reckless actions. This narrative, though riddled with holes and inconsistencies, was readily accepted by the court. It provided a convenient explanation for the tragedy, one that didn't threaten the established order or expose any uncomfortable truths. The accused were paraded through the streets, their faces contorted with pain and shame. The crowd, eager for blood, hurled insults and stones. Lady Beatrice and the kitchen maid were sentenced to be burned at the stake. Their screams echoed through the city as the flames consumed them, a gruesome spectacle of public justice. The corrupt guard, deemed less culpable, was sentenced to life imprisonment. With the execution of the accused, the case was officially closed. The king, satisfied that justice had been served, turned his attention to the more pressing matters of state. The wedding night fire, though a tragedy, was quickly relegated to the annals of history, a footnote in the grand narrative of the kingdom. But the truth, like embers buried beneath the ashes, continued to smolder, waiting for the right moment to ignite once more. The scapegoats had been chosen, but the question of who truly set the fire remained unanswered. And in the shadows, whispers of conspiracy and political intrigue continued to circulate, hinting at a far more sinister truth than anyone dared to imagine. The trial. A farce, really. A charade performed for the benefit of a court already convinced of its verdict. Picture this: a cold, drafty hall, packed with whispering nobles, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. The air hangs thick with suspicion and the stench of unwashed bodies. All eyes are fixed on the accused, or more accurately, the accused, plural because guilt spreads like a disease in these situations. It rarely stops with just one unfortunate soul. Who would be brave enough to raise their voice against the king? Few, if any, dared to speak against the will of the crown. And it was not just the king. It was the entire weight of the royal court, the church, and centuries of tradition pressing down on anyone who even considered whispering dissent. The charges are predictably vague and conveniently malleable. Conspiracy against the crown, sorcery, treasonous acts, empty words that carry the weight of a death sentence. Evidence? Circumstantial at best, fabricated at worst. A muttered phrase overheard, a suspicious glance exchanged, a herb found in the accused's possession, twisted and contorted into proof of unimaginable wickedness. Testimony is given. Of course, witnesses are paraded before the court, their words carefully coached, their memory selectively enhanced. Servants eager to curry favor, rivals settling old scores, enemies whispering poisonous lies, all contributing to the chorus of condemnation. And the bride? Her voice is conspicuously absent, silenced either by death or by the suffocating constraints of her position. Her perspective, her truth, irrelevant to the power brokers who determine her fate. She is, at best, a ghost haunting the proceedings, a silent accusation etched onto the faces of the accused. At worst, she's already been erased from the narrative, her immolation reduced to a mere footnote in the grand tapestry of royal intrigue. The accused are questioned, interrogated, pressured to confess. Torture, though rarely explicitly acknowledged, lurks in the shadows, a constant, unspoken threat. Sleep deprivation, starvation, the rack, tools of persuasion designed to break the will and extract the desired admission of guilt. And even if they maintain their innocence, even if they vehemently deny the charges, it matters little. The court has already made up its mind. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. Justice? A hollow word, a cruel joke whispered in the corners of the hall. Perhaps a low-ranking servant testifies, their voice trembling, recounting whispers they overheard. They speak of resentment, of envy, of a simmering discontent brewing beneath the surface of the court. Maybe they mention the bride's unhappiness, her quiet rebellion against the arranged marriage, her desperate longing for freedom. These words, however, are not used to exonerate the accused. Instead, they are twisted and repurposed, woven into a narrative of malice and intent. The accused, it is claimed, saw the bride's vulnerability and exploited it, manipulating her emotions, fueling her discontent, and ultimately driving her to A desperate act of self-destruction, or perhaps a rival appears, their eyes gleaming with triumph, recounting past conflicts and grievances. They speak of insults, betrayals, and broken promises. They paint a picture of a ruthless and ambitious individual, willing to stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Again, the truth is irrelevant. The court is not interested in nuance or context. They seek only confirmation of their pre-existing biases. The accused is guilty, and any evidence, no matter how flimsy or contrived, will be used to reinforce that belief. And what of the deeper truths, the uncomfortable realities that dare not be spoken aloud? The king's cruelty, his paranoia, his insatiable thirst for power. The court's corruption, its venality, its willingness to sacrifice anyone to protect its own interests. The church's hypocrisy, its moral bankruptcy, its complicity in the perpetuation of injustice. These are the secrets that fester beneath the surface, the unspoken truths that haunt the proceedings like specters. But no one dares to acknowledge them, to voice the questions that everyone is thinking. To do so would be to invite the same fate as the accused. The trial drags on, a morbid spectacle designed to appease the masses and reinforce the authority of the ruling elite. Days bleed into nights, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. The accused, exhausted and demoralized, cling to the last vestiges of hope, praying for a miracle that will never come. The final verdict is delivered, solemn and self-righteous. The accused are found guilty, their fate sealed. The sentence is swift and merciless. Execution, banishment, imprisonment, whatever punishment best serves the interests of the crown. And as the condemned are led away, their cries of innocence echoing through the hall, a chilling silence descends. The nobles breathe a collective sigh of relief, reassured that justice has been served and order restored. But in their hearts, a seed of doubt remains. A nagging suspicion that perhaps, just perhaps, they have condemned an innocent person. Lingering fear that the true culprits remain at large, their crimes concealed behind a veil of power and privilege. The absence of justice for the bride is complete. She is not mourned, not avenged, not even remembered. Her immolation becomes a footnote, a tragic incident that serves only to reinforce the dangers of disobedience and the absolute power of the crown. And the cycle of violence and injustice continues, perpetuated by fear, silence, and the unwavering belief that some lives are simply worth more than others. The screams of the accused fade, and there is only the echo of injustice. The bride's funeral pyre wasn't just a funeral. It was a political bonfire. The flames consumed more than flesh and bone. They devoured truth, whispered secrets, and the fragile threads that held the kingdom's power structure together. Initially, the fire served as a convenient smokescreen. A deranged act, a tragic accident. These were the murmurs carefully cultivated by the royal court. But the court underestimated the persistent scent of conspiracy, lingering like smoke in the tapestries. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of damage control. The wedding, intended to solidify alliances and project an image of unwavering strength, instead broadcast weakness and instability. Foreign dignitaries, already wary of the king's increasingly erratic behavior, now saw him as tainted, cursed. Trade agreements faltered, negotiations stalled, and the once flowing coffers began to run dry. Whispers of succession battles and rival claimants to the throne grew louder, fueled by the perception that the royal lineage itself was jeopardized. Internally, the political landscape shifted violently. Key advisors who had championed the marriage found themselves ostracized, their influence waning. The families of potential brides from other noble houses withdrew their daughters from consideration, fearing a similar fate. The king, isolated and paranoid, lashed out, his decisions becoming more impulsive and irrational. The kingdom teetered on the brink of civil war, not from invading armies, but from its own internal combustion. But perhaps the most insidious consequence, was the societal silence. The bride's death, though a horrifying spectacle, became a taboo subject. People lowered their voices when discussing it, averted their eyes at the mention of her name. Fear permeated every layer of society. Fear of the king's wrath, fear of being associated with perceived disloyalty, and a deeper, more primal fear of acknowledging the darkness that resided within the heart of power. The church, ever opportunistic, seized upon the tragedy to reinforce its own authority. Sermons preached about the dangers of disobedience, the importance of female submission, and the divine punishment that awaited those who strayed from the righteous path. The bride, once a symbol of hope and fertility, was now recast as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences of defying God's will, conveniently aligning with the king's will. Of course, historians, or rather, the court-appointed chroniclers, began to subtly rewrite the narrative. The bride's character was subtly maligned, hints of her supposed instability and defiance woven into the official records. Eyewitness accounts that contradicted the accepted version were suppressed, their authors conveniently disappearing or recanting their stories. The truth, like the bride's body, was systematically incinerated, leaving behind only ashes and carefully crafted propaganda. The erosion of truth extended beyond the immediate events surrounding the fire. It seeped into every aspect of society, poisoning the well of public discourse. Trust eroded, cynicism flourished, and the people became increasingly disengaged from the political process. Why speak out, they reasoned, when the truth was so easily manipulated, when dissent could be met with swift and brutal reprisal? Years turned into decades, and the bride's story faded into legend, distorted by time and political machinations. The official version, a sanitized and heavily edited account, became the accepted historical record. But beneath the surface, whispers persisted. Secret societies formed, dedicated to preserving the true story, passing down forbidden knowledge through generations. These clandestine groups kept the flame of truth alive, waiting for an opportunity to expose the lies that had been so carefully constructed. The societal silence wasn't absolute. It was selective. Publicly, everyone adhered to the official narrative. Privately, the women of the court, the servants, the midwives, whispered amongst themselves. They knew the truth, or at least fragments of it, pieced together from overheard conversations and clandestine observations. They understood the bride's fear, her isolation, her desperation, and they silently vowed to remember her, to honor her memory by protecting their own daughters from a similar fate. The political repercussions were far-reaching. The kingdom never fully recovered from the scandal. The king's reign was marked by increasing paranoia and instability, culminating in a series of disastrous wars and internal rebellions. The royal dynasty eventually collapsed, replaced by a new order that promised reform and justice. But even this new regime was haunted by the ghost of the bride, a constant reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of safeguarding the truth. And so the fire continued to burn, not in the physical realm, but in the collective consciousness of the kingdom. A fire of injustice, of suppressed truth, of societal complicity. A fire that would eventually erupt, consuming the lies and revealing the hidden history of the royal bride who was sacrificed on her wedding night. The silence, once deafening, would eventually be broken by a chorus of voices demanding justice, not just for the bride, but for all those who had been silenced by the powerful. The erosion of truth had a limit. Eventually, the weight of lies became too heavy to bear. So, we've established that what went on behind closed doors wasn't really behind closed doors at all. But how did society get to this point? How did something as intensely personal as sex become a public affair? To understand the horror that befell our royal bride, we need to delve into the historical context, specifically the complex relationship between the church, the prevailing power dynamics, and the shocking acceptability of public shame. First, Let's tackle the elephant in the room, or rather the bishop in the bedroom, the church's role. It's easy to assume the church was a monolithic force of sexual repression, constantly wagging its finger at anyone experiencing pleasure. But the reality is far more nuanced and, frankly, more disturbing. The church wasn't just about abstinence. It was about control. Control over bodies, control over reproduction, and ultimately, control over power. Marriage, in particular, was a sacrament, but it was also a strategic alliance, a way to secure land, titles, and political stability. The church, therefore, had a vested interest in ensuring marriages were valid, and validity meant consummation. Why? Because consummation meant the possibility of heirs, the continuation of the bloodline, and the preservation of power. No heir meant instability, succession crises, and potential upheaval. So the church became the self-appointed guardian of marital fidelity, even if it meant invading the most intimate spaces. But it gets even murkier. While preaching moral purity, the church also benefited financially from the very activities it condemned. Think about it. Annulments, granted when a marriage couldn't be consummated, were incredibly lucrative. Indulgences, often sold to atone for sexual sins, filled the church's coffers. And let's not forget the vast estates owned by bishops, some of which included taverns, brothels, and other establishments offering less than pious entertainment. The church, in many ways, was running a shadow entertainment industry, profiting from the very desires it publicly denounced. This hypocrisy created a breeding ground for paranoia and suspicion. If even the highest members of the clergy were susceptible to temptation, then no one was above scrutiny. And that scrutiny often manifested as public displays of judgment and shame. Now, let's talk about power dynamics. Medieval society was a rigid hierarchy, with the nobility at the top and everyone else scrambling for scraps below. Marriage was a key tool for maintaining this power structure. Royal and aristocratic marriages weren't about love. They were about alliances, consolidating wealth, and ensuring the survival of the dynasty. This meant brides were often pawns in a larger game, their bodies and reproductive capacities traded like commodities. A royal bride, especially one from a foreign land, was under immense pressure to produce an heir, and quickly. Her worth was tied to her fertility, and her failure to conceive could have dire consequences, ranging from public humiliation to annulment or even worse. The wedding night, therefore, became a moment of intense scrutiny, not just from the church, but from the entire court. Everyone was watching, waiting, and judging, because the future of the kingdom hung in the balance. And then there's the issue of consent. We tend to think of consent as a modern concept, but the seeds of it were certainly present in medieval thought. However, for royal brides, consent was often a formality, a legal nicety rather than a genuine expression of will. A young bride, often betrothed at a tender age, had little say in her own destiny. Her marriage was arranged, her duties were prescribed, and her body was considered the property of her husband and his family. Resistance was not only discouraged, but often brutally punished, which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the acceptability of public shame. In our modern society, privacy is considered a fundamental right. We have laws protecting our personal information, and we recoil at the thought of our intimate lives being exposed to public scrutiny. But in medieval society, public shame was a powerful tool of social control. It was used to enforce moral norms, punish transgressions, and maintain the existing power structure. Adultery, for example, was a crime punishable by public humiliation. Adulterers might be paraded through the streets, stripped naked, or forced to wear signs advertising their sin. The goal was to shame them, to ostracize them from the community, and to deter others from following in their footsteps. And this wasn't just for the lower classes. Even nobles and royalty could be subjected to public shame, although the consequences were often less severe. The point is, public shame was a constant threat, hanging over everyone's heads. And it was often weaponized against women, particularly those who dared to challenge the status quo. A woman who was deemed disobedient, unfaithful, or infertile could be subjected to public ridicule and scorn, her reputation ruined, and her life made miserable. So, let's recap the Church's complex relationship with sexuality, the rigid power dynamics of medieval society, and the widespread acceptability of public shame all combined to create a climate of intense pressure and scrutiny, particularly for royal brides. Their bodies were political instruments, their reproductive capacities were matters of state, and their private lives were subject to public judgment. This is the context in which our bride found herself, a context that made her wedding night a potential powder keg waiting for a spark. And as we'll see, that spark was tragically and horrifically ignited. It's tempting to dismiss this as ancient history, a bizarre chapter closed in the dusty tomes of the past. To see the burning bride, the violated wedding night, the public trials and humiliations as relics of a less enlightened age. A morbid curiosity, nothing more. But that would be a dangerous and, frankly, delusional mistake. The echoes of the past reverberate in the present, shaping our understanding of privacy, autonomy, and the very fabric of our societies. The struggle for these rights is not a linear progression, a steady march toward enlightenment. It's a constant tug-of-war, a push and pull between individual freedom and societal control. Consider the insidious creep of surveillance in our modern world. Every click, every search, every social media post is meticulously tracked and analyzed. Our digital lives, arguably more intimate than any medieval bedchamber, are laid bare for corporations and governments to scrutinize. The argument is always the same: security, convenience, progress. Are we sacrificing our privacy, our autonomy, on the altar of efficiency? Are we sleepwalking into a world where every aspect of our lives is subject to public scrutiny, where dissent is silenced and individuality is crushed? The justifications offered for the violations in the past, religious dogma, political stability, societal order, sound eerily familiar to the justifications offered today. It's for your own good. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. These are the same justifications used to strip away rights, to silence opposition, to maintain power. And what of the objectification of women? The relentless pressure to conform to impossible standards of beauty and behavior? While we may no longer drag brides naked through the streets, the pervasive gaze of social media, the constant barrage of images depicting idealized versions of femininity, creates a different kind of public spectacle. Women are still judged, scrutinized, and shamed for their bodies, their choices, their very existence. The burning bride may be a literal image from the past, but the metaphorical flames of societal expectations continue to scorch women today. Look closely at the power dynamics at play in these historical events. The church, the monarchy, the patriarchy, all colluded to maintain control over individual lives, particularly the lives of women. Marriage was not about love or companionship. It was about property, power, and lineage. Women were merely pawns. In a larger game, their bodies used to secure alliances and produce heirs. Have these power dynamics truly disappeared? Consider the prevalence of gender-based violence, the persistent wage gap, the underrepresentation of women in positions of power. The structures may have changed, but the underlying inequalities remain. The struggle for female autonomy, for the right to control one's own body and destiny, is far from over. The case of the royal bride, set ablaze on her wedding night, is a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power, of the dangers of silencing dissenting voices, of the fragility of individual freedom. It is a story of injustice, of betrayal, of the crushing weight of societal expectations. But it is also a story of resistance, of a woman who, in her own way, refused to be silenced. Her act, whatever the motivation, served as a defiance against the forces arrayed against her. We must remember her story, not as a lurid tale of medieval barbarity, but as a cautionary tale for our own time. We must be vigilant against the erosion of privacy, the encroachment of surveillance, and the perpetuation of inequalities. We must defend the rights of the marginalized, amplify the voices of the silenced, and challenge the structures of power that seek to control us. Because the flames that consumed the royal bride still flicker in the shadows of our society. Burn in the hearts of those who are oppressed, who are silenced, who are denied their basic human rights. And it is our responsibility to ensure that those flames do not ignite again, consuming us all in their inferno. The past is never truly dead. It is not even past. It lives on in our present, shaping our future. Let us learn from the mistakes of our ancestors and build a world where privacy, autonomy, and justice are not privileges, but fundamental rights for all. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in recognizing the slow, incremental nature of oppression. It rarely arrives in a single cataclysmic event. More often, it's a gradual tightening of the screws, a chipping away at freedoms, a normalization of the unacceptable. Small compromises are made, seemingly insignificant concessions are granted. Until one day, we wake up to find ourselves living in a world we no longer recognize. Therefore, vigilance is paramount. We must constantly question authority, challenge prevailing narratives, and defend our rights with unwavering resolve. We must remember that privacy is not a luxury. It is a necessity for a free and just society. It is the bedrock upon which individual autonomy and democratic values are built. And finally, let us remember the humanity of the burning bride. She was not merely a historical footnote, a nameless victim of a brutal age. She was a woman with dreams, hopes, and fears. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She deserved better than the fate she met. And by remembering her story, by learning from her tragedy, we can honor her memory and ensure that such atrocities never happen again. Her struggle, though centuries old, resonates powerfully today. It reminds us that the fight for freedom and justice is a continuous journey, one that demands our constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. Only then can we truly say that we have learned from the past and are building a better future for all.